a face in the peat, a rope around the neck, an expression 2,000 years old, a story everyone agreed on. For 50 years, scientists believed they knew these people, outcasts of the Iron Age, criminals, adulterers, the disgraced, dragged to the edge of a marsh, killed, and pressed down into the dark water as punishment. The bogs of Northern Europe gave back their faces, and museums gave back their stories. Tortured, sacrificed, drowned for their sins. Millions of visitors filed past the placards and believed every word. DNA says otherwise. The most famous girl ever pulled from a European bog was not who the world was told. She was not a criminal. She was not even a girl. And once the science proved that, the question turned to all the others lying in the peat beside her. We had been reading them wrong for half a century. In 1950, two men cutting peat in a Danish bog found a body lying beneath their spades. The face was calm. The eyes were closed. There was stubble on the chin and a leather cord pulled tight around the throat. The men did what anyone would do. They called the police, certain they had uncovered a recent murder. They had. The murder was simply 2,400 years old. This was the Tolland man, and he is not unusual in this respect. Across the wetlands of Northern Europe, in Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, and Ireland, the peat has been giving back human bodies for centuries, and giving them back in a state that should not be possible. Not skeletons, not fragments. Faces. Skin tanned to the color of dark leather. Fingerprints still legible at the tips of the fingers. The last meal still sitting in the stomach. Identifiable down to the individual grains of seed. The reason is chemistry, and it is precise. A peat bog is a closed, airless world. The water is cold, acidic, and almost entirely without oxygen, and decay needs oxygen to proceed. The bacteria that would normally consume a body within weeks cannot survive there. On top of that, the moss that forms the bog releases a compound that tans skin the way a leather worker tans a hide, sealing it against time. A body submerged quickly before the warmth of the open air could begin its work can lie in that dark water for thousands of years and emerge looking as though it died last season. The proof is scattered across the continent. Graubaugh man, found 2 years after Tolland man, kept a throat wound cut so cleanly it remains visible today. Lindow man, pulled from an English bog, still carried the stubble of his trimmed beard across his upper lip. There is a catch, and it matters for everything that follows. The same acid that preserves the skin will, in many bogs, slowly dissolve the bone. So the most famous bog bodies, the ones with faces, are often soft tissue wrapped around very little structure. In other wetlands, the chemistry runs the other way, and only the bones survive while the skin is gone. Two kinds of preservation. Two kinds of evidence. For a long time, science paid attention to only one of them. What the preservation produced was something archaeology almost never offers. Intimacy. You can stand in a museum in Silkeborg or Dublin and look an Iron Age person in the face. You can see the set of the mouth, the lines around the eyes, the way the hair was cut. You can see what they ate and how they died. These are not statues or reconstructions. They are the people themselves, held across 2,000 years by an accident of mud and water, close enough to touch through a pane of glass. That intimacy is exactly why they became the most studied dead in all of European archaeology. Every detail invited a story. The rope invited a hanging, the wound invited a crime, the calm face invited a meaning. And the scientists who first studied them, working with the tools of their time, built those stories carefully, confidently, and in good faith. But intimacy is not the same as understanding. The bog had preserved the bodies perfectly. It had not preserved the truth about who they were or why they ended up in the water. That answer would take another half a century, and when it came, it would dismantle almost everything the museums had put on display. The man who fixed the story in place was a Danish archaeologist named Peter Wilhelm Glob. In 1965, he published a book called The Bog People, and it did something rare for a work of archaeology. It reached everyone. It was elegant, haunting, and certain, and for 2 generations it told the world what the bodies in the peat meant. Glob reached back to a Roman source for his framework. In the 1st century, the historian Tacitus had written about the tribes of the north, and he described a particular custom. The cowardly, the deserters, the disgraced, he wrote, were pushed down into the bogs and held there under hurdles of woven branches. Here was a Roman eyewitness, or near enough, describing the exact thing the peat kept producing. Bodies, drowned, pinned beneath the surface. The fit seemed perfect. So the portrait took shape, and it was a compelling one. These were the dead of the Iron Age, and they had not died ordinary deaths. They were ritual sacrifices offered to the gods of the marsh, or they were criminals and outcasts punished by their own communities. Adulterers, thieves, the shamed, tortured, then executed, then drowned, then sealed beneath the water so they could never return. And the bodies appeared to confirm it at every turn. Tolland Man wore the noose that had hanged him, the leather still knotted at his throat. Graubaugh Man's throat had been cut from ear to ear, a wound far beyond anything an accident could explain. Others were found with twisted limbs, with fractured skulls, with bodies bent into unnatural positions, and each of these was read as the signature of violence done deliberately, a punishment carried through to its end. It was a story that explained everything. The wounds, the ropes, the strange placements, the youth of some of the victims. It matched the Roman texts. It matched the brutality the bones seemed to show. And it matched something deeper, a sense that these calm, preserved faces were the faces of people who had suffered, singled out and sent into the dark for reasons the living had decided. The narrative did not stay in the universities. It spread everywhere. It filled the textbooks that schoolchildren read. It was printed on the placards beside the glass cases in Silkeborg and Dublin and London, where millions of visitors absorbed it as settled fact. The Irish poet Seamus Heaney built an entire sequence of poems around these bodies, around the sacrificed and the punished of the bog, and his verses carried the image into the imagination of readers who would never see a museum. Documentary after documentary repeated the same account. The sacrificed sinner in the marsh became one of the most familiar pictures of the ancient North, and it is important to be fair to the people who built it. They were not careless. They were working with the evidence in front of them, the wounds they could see, the ropes they could hold, the Roman words that seemed to match. They had no way to test sex from a fragment of bone. They could not trace where a person had grown up from the chemistry of a tooth. They could not date 2 bodies precisely enough to know whether they had ever lived in the same century. With the tools of their time, the story they told was the best the evidence allowed, and they told it in good faith. But the tools did not stay still. And when the new ones arrived, the first body they turned on was the most famous girl ever lifted from the peat. In 1952, in a bog near the village of Windeby in northern Germany, peat workers uncovered the body of a child. The remains were slight and young, and the scientists who examined them concluded they belonged to a girl of around 14. From that single conclusion, an entire story unfolded, and it became one of the most retold tales in all of bog archaeology. The picture they assembled was vivid. Half of the girl's head appeared to have been shaved, the other half left with hair. A woolen band lay across her face, and it was read as a blindfold. Her body had been held down in the water beneath branches. Here, it seemed, was Tacitus made flesh. A young woman, an adulteress, shamed before her community. Her hair shorn as a mark of disgrace, her eyes covered, led to the marsh and drowned and pinned beneath the surface as punishment for her sin. The story grew richer still. Another body, a man, had been found in the same bog years earlier. The two were joined together in the telling. He became her lover, executed alongside her for the same forbidden affair, the pair of them sent into the dark water for a love their people would not permit. For half a century, this tragedy was repeated in books and exhibitions and films. The doomed couple of the German bog, blindfolded and shorn and drowned for the crime of devotion. Then the tools changed. In the mid-2000s, a researcher named Heather Gill-Robinson, working in the new field of ancient genetics, was able to do something the original scientists never could. She tested the body's DNA to determine its sex directly, reading it from the genetic material itself rather than guessing from the size of the bones. The result was not female. It was male. The Windeby Girl had never been a girl. He was a boy, an adolescent, and with that single finding, the entire story began to come apart in the hands of the people who had told it. The careful reconstruction of the shamed adulteress collapsed in an afternoon, and once the foundation was gone, the rest followed. A closer look at the body found none of the wounds that an execution should leave. There was no violence on him at all. What the bones did show was a boy who had been frail and malnourished, his body marked by illness and poor nutrition, the kind of child who might simply have died of natural causes in a hard season. The blindfold was reconsidered and judged most likely a headband that had slipped from his hair as the body settled. The famous half-shaved head was reconsidered too, and attributed not to ritual shaming but to uneven preservation in the peat and rough handling during the excavation itself. There had been no blindfold, there had been no shaving, there had been no punishment. And the lover. When radiocarbon dating was finally applied to both bodies, the dates returned a verdict that ended the romance entirely. The man had lived roughly 3 centuries before the boy. They had not died together. They had not loved. They had never breathed the same air, never stood in the same world, separated by 300 years of history that no one had thought to measure. 2 strangers, pulled from the same mud at different times, married into a single tragedy by people who wanted a story. The most famous love story in the bog had never happened. And if the science could dismantle that so completely and so quickly, then every other body in the peat was suddenly an open question. The question that Windeby opened was not about one body, it was about all of them. If the most famous story in the peat had been an invention, how many of the others were inventions too? Answering that required something no single excavation could provide. It required stepping back from the spectacular individual bodies and looking at the whole. In 2023, a team led by the Dutch archaeologist Roy van Beek did exactly that. They assembled the first comprehensive survey of bog bodies ever attempted, published in the journal Antiquity, and the scale of it changed the conversation entirely. They gathered more than 1,000 individuals from 266 sites, stretching from Ireland in the west across to the Baltic states in the east. For the first time, the bog dead were being counted not as a handful of famous faces, but as a population. The crucial decision was about what to include. For decades, the field had fixed its attention on the bog mummies, the preserved bodies with skin and hair, because they were extraordinary and they told human stories. But Van Beek's team insisted on counting the others as well. The bog skeletons. In wetlands, where the chemistry runs differently, the skin is lost and only the bones survive, and these had largely been set aside as less interesting. Put back into the record, they revealed how badly the famous mummies had distorted the picture. The spectacular bodies everyone knew were only a thin slice of a far larger phenomenon, and once the full record was assembled, the central pillar of the old story simply fell. The tradition was not a moment in the Iron Age. It was not a brief, dark fashion confined to a few centuries before the Romans. It stretched across roughly 7,000 years. The earliest deposits began in southern Scandinavia in the Neolithic, around 5,000 years BCE, when farming was still new to the north. The practice spread gradually across the wetlands of Europe, and it did not stop with the Iron Age. It continued through the Roman period into the Middle Ages and in places right up to the early modern era. People had been ending up in these bogs for longer than the entire span of recorded European history. Across that immense stretch of time, the reasons could not possibly be one thing, and the survey showed that they were not. Some of the dead were accidents, travelers who lost their way and drowned in treacherous mires that swallowed anyone who stepped wrong. Some were ordinary burials, the bog simply used as a grave. Some were victims of murder, killed for reasons that had nothing to do with ritual. Some were the casualties of war, left where they fell. And some, yes, were deliberate deposits tied to belief, bodies given to the marsh for reasons the people of the time understood as sacred. Not one explanation. Many. Violence was real in the record, but it was not universal. The team could establish a cause of death for only 57 of the individuals, and of those, violence was indicated in 45. The survey traced surges in violent death to particular windows, one running from around 5,200 to 2,800 years BCE, another from 1,000 years BCE to 1,100 years after it. The brutality was real, but it was concentrated, varied, and spread across millennia, not stamped uniformly on a single doomed generation. The deaths were not one story, and as the science would show next, the people doing the dying were not who the old account had claimed either. The old story did not only describe how these people died, it described who they were, local people. Members of the community Quechotwa that killed them, criminals and outcasts drawn from the villages beside the bog, shamed by their own neighbors and disposed of close to home. It was an intimate picture, a community punishing its own. And it turned out to be testable, because the body keeps a record of where a person has been. The record is written in chemistry, in an element called strontium. Strontium enters the body through food and water, and its precise signature varies from one region to another depending on the underlying rock and soil. As a person grows, that signature is locked into the enamel of the teeth and the structure of the bones, and it stays there. Read it carefully, and you can tell whether someone spent their life in the place where they were buried, or whether they came from somewhere far away. The Danish researcher Karen Frey applied this analysis to some of the most famous bog women in the collections, and the results pulled against the local narrative. The Holdremos woman and the Haraldskar woman, two of the best-known female bodies in Denmark, did not carry the chemistry of people who had lived their whole lives beside the marsh that held them. Their signatures spoke of movement, of distance, of origins somewhere else, and journeys made before death. These were not rooted villagers. They were travelers. That single shift changes the meaning of everything around them. If the dead in the bog included outsiders, foreigners, people who had come from far away, then the picture of the shamed local criminal cannot hold for all of them. An outsider in an Iron Age community might be many things: a hostage taken in a raid, a traitor, a person of high status married in from a distant region, someone whose foreignness itself made them significant. If a death in the marsh was sometimes a sacred act rather than a punishment, then the person chosen for it may have been special rather than disgraced, valued rather than condemned. This is where the surviving belief systems of the period become important, and they have to be read for what they are, not as confirmed truths about gods in the afterlife, but as the worldview of the people who lived then, reconstructed from archaeology and from the patterns in the evidence. In Ireland, the archaeologist Eamon Kelly proposed one such reading. Looking at bodies like the Old Krogan Man and the Cloney Man, he suggested they were not common criminals at all, but failed kings or members of the elite, offered to the land at the boundaries of their territories when their reigns went wrong. It is a powerful interpretation, but it is a regional one, fitted to Irish evidence and Irish kingship, and it was never meant to be a single law stretched across the whole of Europe. That is the deeper correction. There was never one kind of person in the bog. There was a malnourished boy in Germany. There were traveling women in Denmark whose homelands lay elsewhere. There were possible kings in the Irish Midlands. There were accident victims and murder victims, and the ordinary buried dead, scattered across 7,000 years in a continent of wetlands. The old account had taken 1,000 separate human beings and pressed them into a single category, the disgraced sinner of the marsh, and the category was never real. Step back from all of it, and you can finally see what 50 years of certainty had actually been. Set the two pictures side by side, and the distance between them is the whole story. The old picture was singular and grim. One kind of person, the disgraced sinner of the Iron Age. One kind of death, ritual punishment, one narrow window of time a few dark centuries before the Romans came north. 1,000 bodies pressed into a single sentence and displayed behind glass with the matter settled. The new picture is something else entirely. A tradition stretching across 7,000 years, from the first farmers of the Neolithic to the edge of the modern world. Mummies and skeletons counted together at last, the famous faces finally understood as a fraction of a far larger record. Deaths that were sometimes sacred, sometimes criminal, sometimes accidental, sometimes the wreckage of war. Not one explanation imposed on everyone, but a continent of separate human endings, each with its own cause. And the specifics, the things the science actually overturned, are worth holding together in one place. A boy mistaken for a girl, his sex read wrong for half a century until the genetics corrected it. A love story that never happened. Two strangers separated by 300 years, married into a single tragedy by people who wanted one. Travelers mistaken for locals, women whose chemistry proved they came from somewhere far from the marsh that kept them. 3 errors, 3 corrections, and behind each one a real person who had been turned into something they were not. What replaces the myth is not smaller. It is larger and stranger and more human. Not one tragedy endlessly retold, but thousands of individual lives, each particular, each specific, each lost to the dark water for its own reason and found again by accident thousands of years later. The single haunting story was always less than the truth. The truth was 1,000 stories, and the bog had been keeping every one of them. It is worth being honest about why the mistake lasted as long as it did, because the bog itself never lied. The bodies were exactly what they appeared to be. The error was in the reading. The first scientists looked at these faces through the words of a Roman historian who despised the tribes he described, and through the pull of a story that was simply too elegant to resist. They saw punishment because they were told to expect it. They saw sinners because the framework they inherited had no other category to offer, and they worked with tools that could not tell a boy from a girl, could not measure where a person had grown up, could not date 2 bodies precisely enough to know whether they had ever met. Given all of that, the story they built was the best the evidence allowed. It was simply wrong. And here's the part that should stay with you. The people in the peat were not primitive figures from some cruder version of humanity. They were modern humans with the same minds we carry now, living lives as varied and complicated as any 1,000 people who have ever existed. Some were loved, some were feared. Some were honored, some were murdered. Some simply took a wrong step in the dark and never climbed out. They were not a category. They were never a category. We gave them one. We took a malnourished boy, a traveling woman, a fallen king, and a drowned wanderer, and we called them all by the same name and told the same sad story over every one of them. The bog had been trying to tell us otherwise the entire time. a face in the peat, a rope around the neck, an expression 2,000 years old, a story everyone agreed on. For 50 years, that story held. The sinner, the sacrifice, the shamed soul drowned in the dark. Then the science arrived, and it took the story apart one body at a time. DNA proved the most famous of them was not even the sex we believed. The survey proved they were never one people, never one age, never one death. They were thousands of individuals scattered across 7,000 years. Accident, murder, burial, belief. We had handed them a single ending. They had 1,000, and everyone was real, and everyone was theirs. The bog kept them perfectly. We are only now learning how to read what it kept. Discovery continues. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover the cases history got wrong.